On the last day of May 1862, heavy gunfire rumbles and thunders in the distance beyond the Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia. Gloomy clouds overhead reinforced the darkness that shadows the Union Army. Only the day before, Major General George B. McClellan's Army of the Potomac had seemed poised to move decisively against Richmond. But a torrential rainstorm that night had turned the roads into deep quagmires. McClellan, as usual, decides to wait. By late May, weeks of successful campaigning had brought the Federal enemy nearly to the gates of Richmond. So close to the rebel capital are the lead elements of McClellan's Army of the Potomac that they can hear the clanging of church bells in Richmond, and they can spot the distant church steeples dotting Richmond's cityscape. Both Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston and Union Major General George B. McClellan are thoughtful, cautious commanders. McClellan, in particular, constantly pleads for reinforcements. President Lincoln wants more aggressive action, grumbles that the general had a bad case of the slows. McClellan believes he is facing a Confederate army much larger than his own. In reality, he outnumbers the enemy by 40,000 men. For his part, Johnston knows he is outnumbered and seeks to keep his army out of harm's way while he waits for a chance to strike a decisive blow against the enemy. As the Union Army edges ever closer to Richmond, the James River offers a tempting avenue for the Navy to aid the campaign with heavy artillery and ironclad vessels. On May 15th, a Union Navy flotilla is battered by stubborn Confederate guns atop the high ground along the river at Drury's Bluff. The armor of the ironclads USS Monitor and USS Galena could not withstand the advantageously placed land batteries and had to turn back. It becomes plain that the James will not lead Northern forces into Richmond. The Union Navy's failure does not assuage worries in Richmond about the advancing enemy, and Johnston's next move only increases the alarm. Although Confederate batteries block the James, Johnston worries that the Union forces might still approach the capital from the river below Drury's Bluff. Accordingly, he withdraws all his troops south of the Chickahominy River. The troops settle into positions 3 miles east of Richmond, behind the line of earthworks dug the year before. Even more alarming to the Confederate prospects are reports about Union Major General Irvin McDowell's First Corps, numbering more than 30,000 men. McDowell's corps has kept well north of Richmond to guard Washington. Now it is reported to be marching towards Fredericksburg on its way south to join McClellan. Uniting First Corps with McClellan's men would create an overwhelming army of 135,000 troops, the largest military force yet seen in North America. Although the potential junction with McDowell would create a vast and unstoppable Union force, it also gives Johnston an opening. To speed the Union with McDowell while maintaining pressure on Richmond, McClellan has dangerously split his vast army in two, keeping most of his men north to be nearer to McDowell. McClellan shifts 2 corps south of the Chickahominy. If Johnston swiftly strikes and crushes the detachment below the river, the remaining Union forces would be vulnerable to a quick attack. The Chickahominy River is an insignificant squiggly line on a map, only 15 yards wide in dry weather. Before the war, several bridges provided easy crossing points, but the shallow river is easily fordable in many places. Occasionally splitting into multiple streams to flow around swampy islands, the river twists through a belt of wooded wetlands 300 to 400 yards wide. Beyond the swamps, the terrain rises slightly into stretches of woods or cleared and cultivated bottomland cut with drainage ditches. Despite its shallowness, the Chickahominy is a formidable barrier. The month of May is notorious for relentless and heavy rain, and the river overflows its banks and keeps on rising over wide stretches of swamps and bottomlands. Farther back from the stream, the ground is so saturated with water that it has become a marshy quagmire in which artillery, wagons, and horses are virtually useless. General Johnston orders all the Chickahominy bridges destroyed after he withdraws south of the river on May 16th. Union troops set to work building new bridges. They quickly erect Bottom's Bridge, a span crossing the stream at Williamsburg Road on the direct route to Richmond. A short distance upstream, they also repair the Richmond and York River Railroad Bridge. Union forces begin crossing the river on May 20th. Eventually, 2 Union corps, commanded by Brigadier Generals Erasmus D. Keyes and Samuel P. Heintzelman, assume positions on the south bank of the river. McClellan's other three corps, under Brigadier Generals Edwin V. Sumner, William B. Franklin, and Fitzjohn Porter, remained on the north bank. Brigadier General Keyes moves his 4th Corps along the Williamsburg Road. The night of May 26 brings more rain to soak the troops despite their rubber blankets. Pickets posted in thick brush find the night so dark that had a battle line of the enemy been within bayonet's thrust, it would have been invisible. Occasionally skirmishing with the Confederates, troops from Brigadier General Silas Casey's 3rd Division and the 4th Corps settle into a crossroads community called Seven Pines, which is distinguished by 2 curious-looking twin farmhouses. Originally, the houses were intended to be the opposite ends of a much larger mansion. The owners planned to live in the houses while construction went on for the palatial main building, but the intervening rooms were never built. Near the houses is a tremendous woodpile, 10 to 12 feet high and more than 100 feet long. 3/4 of a mile west of Seven Pines, Casey's troops of the 3rd Division cut down trees to build a line of abatis in front of their earthwork. Half a mile to the east of the front line of works, a longer and heavier line of abatis shields the Williamsburg Road in Seven Pines. Between the two lines is the Union camp, situated behind a line of defenses anchored by a 5-sided earthwork fort called Casey's Redoubt. Behind Casey's men is Brigadier General Darius N. Couch's 1st Division. In the rear is Heintzelman's 3rd Corps. Farther back along the Williamsburg Road towards Bottoms Bridge are the 2nd and 3rd Divisions of Brigadier Generals Joseph Hooker and Philip Kearny, respectively. To the left, the Federals are shielded by White Oak Swamp, but to the front and right, the Union works are unprotected by any natural barriers. Keyes recognizes a peril and tells staff officers on May 29th that our position is certain to tempt the enemy to attack us. Seeking to guarantee quick access to reinforcements from across the Chickahominy, Keyes puts his soldiers to work building several new bridges. Bridging the river is only part of the effort needed for the crossing. Each bridge requires hundreds of yards of corduroy roads to provide access across the saturated bottomlands. One of the new bridges is built by the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Company officers supervise the work, with no help from Army engineers. Their hardened lifestyles as lumberjacks and woodworkers in the forested woodlands of Minnesota suits them in this new and improvised line of work. Without regulation bridge materials, soldiers chop down trees in the surrounding woods to hew beams and planks. To support the bridge, they build timber cribs. Each crib sinks deep into the mud, surrounded with stones to weight them down. Long stringers are laid across them to hold the roadway, which is then floored with split logs. Holding the bridge together are withes, flexible branches that firmly lash planks and beams together, while grapevines used for the withes provide the name for the span, Grapevine Bridge. By May 25th, General Johnston has set his plans in motion to attack the divided Union Army, calling in troops from Petersburg, Gordonsville, and Fredericksburg. When assembled, the Confederates would number nearly 75,000. Each of Johnston's 3 top commanders have graduated from West Point in the class of 1842. Major General James Longstreet of South Carolina had served in the Indian Wars and the Mexican War. Also from South Carolina, Major General Daniel Harvey Hill, often shortened to D.H. Hill, had left the Army after the Mexican War to become a college professor and administrator in North Carolina. As colonel of the 1st North Carolina Infantry Regiment, he won an early Confederate victory at the Battle of Big Bethel on June 10, 1861. Kentucky-born Major General Gustavus W. Smith had also left the Army in the 1850s. His training as a military engineer had helped secure him the post of Street Commissioner of New York City. Johnston originally plans to move against the Union forces on both sides of the Chickahominy on May 29th and shatter McClellan's army before it becomes even larger with the addition of McDowell's men. But late on the evening of May 28th, Brigadier General Jeb Stuart sends word that McDowell has been diverted to deal with Major General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson's army in the Shenandoah Valley. For the time being, at least, Johnston could focus on smashing the smaller wing of the Union Army. If the attack succeeds, the odds would be less daunting for an attack on the rest of the Federals north of the stream. The Confederate move is set for Sunday, May 31st. Johnston divides his army in two for the attack. Two of Smith's divisions, under Major Generals Ambrose Powell Hill and Prince John Magruder, would shield the Confederates from enemy troops on the other side of the Chickahominy. For the main attack against the 31,500 troops of Keyes and Heintzelman, Johnston allotted Longstreet 40,000 troops. They would advance along the three different roads and strike from three directions at once. D.H. Hill has orders to take the Williamsburg Stage Road, which runs directly east from Richmond to Seven Pines, and move against the enemy's center and right. Major General Benjamin Huger would cross the Williamsburg Stage Road and take the Charles City Road, which runs to the southeast. From there, a rural road runs north to a position menacing the Federals' left flank. Longstreet, in turn, would take the 9 Mile Road. For several miles, the 9 Mile Road runs parallel into the north of the Williamsburg Stage Road, but it takes a southeastern turn to cross the Richmond and York River Railroad at Fair Oaks before meeting the Williamsburg Stage Road at Seven Pines. Coming down from the northwest against Seven Pines, Longstreet would hit the Union right, prevent the escape of the enemy to Fair Oaks, or block any Union reinforcements coming from the upper Chickahominy. For reinforcements, Brigadier General William H.C. Whiting's division is to follow Longstreet's force. The timing of the attack depends on Huger. Once his troops are in place on the Confederate right, he is to send a message to Hill, who would then open the attack on the enemy center. The sound of Hill's firing would be the signal for Longstreet to move in against the Union right. Huger would then move against the left. Johnston's plan promises great results, but he evidently does not clearly explain it to any of his commanders. To Longstreet, who is placed in charge of the attack, Johnston gives only verbal orders. The two generals speak at length on May 30th, but by the next day it is clear that Longstreet has misunderstood his orders. Huger is not told that he is the key to the Confederate offensive. There is only a vague order advising him to be ready if an action should begin on your left to fall upon the enemy's left flank. It will prove to be a costly oversight. Heavy rain pounds both armies on the night before the attack, and the Chickahominy quickly surges to new heights. At about 11 p.m. on May 30th, a detail of pickets from the 33rd New York go to guard one of the half-built Chickahominy bridges. Within a short time, they are cut off from their main camp by the swiftly rising water. When another shift comes to relieve them at 2 a.m., standing nearly up to their armpits in the now new channel, and others, having lost their footing, were clinging to trees for dear life. The relief detail sends for boats to rescue their comrades. As the rain drifts on throughout the night, the stage is set for battle. In the early morning hours of May 31st, General Johnston prepares his troops for the long-awaited counterattack against McClellan. With the enemy at the gates, time is running short for Johnston's Department of Northern Virginia to repulse the Federals before they can begin a siege against the capital. Unbeknownst to both sides at the moment is the knowledge that the ensuing Battle of Seven Pines, or Battle of Fair Oaks, will become the largest and bloodiest battle of the war's eastern theater to date. On the morning of Sunday, May 31st, 1862, Longstreet's men rise from their camps, bivouacked at the Fairfield Racecourse on the northeastern edge of Richmond, or scattered farther east along the 9 Mile Road. They are within easy reach of the jumping-off position Johnston intends, but for some reason, Longstreet doesn't follow Johnston's plan. Instead of taking the 9 Mile Road towards Seven Pines, Longstreet orders his division to march west, then turn south towards the Williamsburg Stage Road. Longstreet tells no one of his decision to take the Williamsburg Stage Road, and his seemingly casual decision scrambles Johnston's carefully laid plans. Brigadier General Whiting, trying his best to follow orders, finds the 9 Mile Road clogged by Longstreet's men, but is unable to locate any of the senior officers. When Whiting writes to warn Johnston that the road is blocked, the commander sends back a note merely saying that Longstreet will precede him. Going to Johnston's headquarters in person, Whiting finds that no one knows what is happening. Everyone assumes that Longstreet is well down the 9-mile road, and Johnston is surprised when a staff officer is unable to find him anywhere on that road. In fact, a stream called Gillis's Creek, overflowing from the previous night's rains, has blocked Longstreet's march to the Williamsburg Stage Road. To avoid a long detour, his men dive a wagon into the creek and use it to support a makeshift bridge. Ugey arrives on his way to the Charles City Road to open the battle and is forced to halt, while thousands of Longstreet's men trot single file across a little bridge ahead of him. Ugey is stuck near Richmond until 10:30 a.m., long after he is supposed to be facing the Union left flank. Because of Johnston's vague and partial orders, it isn't clear to the other officers that by delaying Ugey, they're delaying the start of the entire operation. Meanwhile, the already worn-out men of Casey's 3rd Division are drenched once again. A horrendous rainstorm the night before has flooded trenches and campsites around the 5-cornered earthwork fortification known as Casey's Redoubt. One soldier remembered that the unfinished rifle pits were filled, and every depression in the roads and elsewhere had become tiny lakes. Although his troops are hungry and miserable, Casey wisely puts them back to work. All is quiet on the picket line until about 9 a.m., when one of General Johnston's staff officers accidentally rides into some pickets from the 100th New York. Although the snared Southerner refuses to cooperate during his interrogation, Casey surmises that something big is up and notifies his superior, Brigadier General Keyes, of his concerns. Casey's fears are soon realized when Captain Simon Townsend of the 85th Pennsylvania, also manning the picket line in Brigadier General Henry W. Wessel's 2nd Brigade sector, notices considerable Confederate activity to his front. Casey at once orders the 103rd Pennsylvania, under temporary command of Major Audley W. Gasm, in the absence of the regiment's sick commander, Colonel Theo F. Lehman, to reinforce the pickets astride the Williamsburg Stage Road, where their own Company C is deployed. While Major Gasm collects his disparate command, D.H. Hill launches his attack with Brigadier General Samuel Garland's brigade. The 300-man 2nd Mississippi Infantry Battalion leads the advance of Garland's brigade as skirmishers, loosing a volley against the tired Federal pickets. After they advance only several hundred yards, the 103rd Pennsylvania's Company C opens fire with a concentrated volley. Outnumbered 4-1, the Keystoners quickly yield to the advancing rebels and retreat 50 yards through the rest of the regiment. For a few key minutes, which gives the rest of the 3rd Division at least some time to gather its forces, the 450 or so men from the 103rd Pennsylvania duel with 2,000 Southerners. The Confederates cascade forward, and Captain Reynolds Laughlin, on the far right of Gasm's line leading Company A, notices that the regiment is being flanked. He calls for his men to fall back as quickly as possible. The tangled undergrowth prevents the 103rd Pennsylvania from falling back in any kind of order. To make matters even worse for the Pennsylvanians, Casey orders his artillery to shell the woods through which they are retreating. Pushed beyond the breaking point, the 103rd Pennsylvania flees. A tree limb hits Major Gasm in the face, knocking him from his mount while he is frantically trying to reassemble his men. If not for the courage and dedication of some of his men who quickly pull him to safety, Gasm, a former attorney from Pittsburgh, would surely have been snagged as a prisoner. With the 103rd Pennsylvania and the rest of Casey's picket line smashed, Garland's brigade begins to negotiate the abattis. This buys time for Brigadier General Casey to personally lead parts of 6 regiments from Nagley's and Palmer's 1st and 3rd Brigades, reinforced by Captain Joseph Spratt's Battery H, 1st New York Light Artillery, forward into line about 200 yards behind the abattis. There, the desperate Federals duel with Garland's winded brigade, bringing it to a standstill. At this juncture, with most of Casey's division engaged in front, Ugey's and Whiting's divisions should have been falling on the Federal flanks and Longstreet's troops ready to reinforce Hill's, but because of jealousy, ineptitude, and a general lack of coordination, all the follow-up divisions are still bundled up in the rear. As Sam Garland's brigade exchanges volleys with Casey's second line, D.H. Hill's right wing, the brigades of Brigadier Generals Robert Rhodes and Gabriel Rains hurry forward after their advance had been delayed. Rhodes' troops exit the woods on the south side of the Williamsburg Stage Road and enter the fray. Hill detaches Rains' troops, ordering them to advance around Casey's left flank and take his works from behind. Colonel George B. Anderson's brigade, meanwhile, is working around the northern edge of the field and the Union right. In all, 6,500 Confederates would be sent against 3,500 Federals. Rains arrives on the scene to confront the left face of the redoubt. General Hill personally leads Captain Thomas H. Carter's Virginia Battery, the King William Artillery, and finds the Virginians a good field of fire against the enemy earthwork. South of the fort, the tall trees edging White Oak Swamp offer ideal firing positions for Confederate sharpshooters. Most of the gunners and 2/5 of Casey's troops are hit. Casey directs a general withdrawal to the redoubt and its adjoining trenches, but Battery H needs time to move its guns to the rear, and the Confederates are coming fast. The division commander therefore orders Brigadier General Nagley to have 3 regiments of his 1st Brigade on the north side of 9 Mile Road, the 104th Pennsylvania, the 11th Maine, and the 100th New York charge and buy time for Battery H. The spoiling attack, one of the first committed by Federal forces in the war, freezes the Confederate advance. General Casey later recalled, "I never saw a handsomer thing in my life than that charge was." While D.H. Hill waits for his troops to deploy, Casey patches his line together as best he can. He also sends back another frantic request to Brigadier General Keyes to send up the 3 brigades from Couch's 1st Division to help solidify his line. Keyes is in fact sending forward reinforcements, but he does so piecemeal, and curiously he does not communicate with either Casey or Couch. As a result, the few regiments that do come to Casey's aid are too little and too late. In front of Hill's Confederates stand the remains of the smallest division of the Army of the Potomac. The keystone of their final line is Casey's redoubt, manned by 6 12-pounder Napoleons from Lieutenant George P. Hart's Battery A, 1st New York Light Artillery. However, Casey's remaining batteries, the 7th and 8th New York Independent Batteries under Captains Peter C. Reagan and Butler Fitch, respectively, are poorly deployed. Colonel Guilford D. Bailey, commanding the artillery of the division, has ineptly positioned the 8th New York Independent Battery behind Battery A. With no clear targets, he situates the 7th New York on the far right of the line, behind infantrymen who present an obstacle and give the gunners a poor field of fire. Knowing that his men cannot withstand the fire, Lieutenant Colonel Brian Grimes of the 4th North Carolina and Anderson's brigade orders his regiment to charge with fixed bayonets. The subsequent attack, which pierces the 85th Pennsylvania's line, is, according to one veteran of the battle, like an avalanche. Colonel Bailey, seeing the conflagration developing on his right, orders the guns in the redoubt spiked. As he moves forward to help a gunner perform the task, he is shot dead. The cannons from the 8th New York open up, and one shell bursts prematurely over the heads of the 85th New York, killing or wounding several. This only hastens their decision to retreat. Meanwhile, events are transpiring at the Confederate headquarters. Although General Johnston is only 2 miles from the developing battle, a peculiar atmospheric condition known as an acoustic shadow muffles the sound of cannon and musket fire. Adding to the confusion, his staff has failed to keep Johnston informed of conditions on the battlefront. In fairness, the belts of thick woods and deep pools of mud and water keeps the aides from gathering and relaying intelligence in a timely manner. Johnston knows only that Longstreet has taken the wrong road several hours ago, and that his whole plan has fallen apart. "I wish all the troops were back in camp," Johnston grumbles. General Johnston's old West Point classmate, General Robert E. Lee, joins him at his headquarters. During the afternoon, they hear a din echo that sounds like cannon fire. Lee thinks he hears a hint of musketry as well, but Johnston concludes that it is merely an exchange of cannon fire. About 4 p.m., the wind shifts enough to allow the cacophonous sounds of battle to reach Johnston. At the same time, a courier arrives with a request from Longstreet for reinforcements. It is the first clear report the Confederate commander has received that day. Johnston leaves his headquarters and personally leads Whiting's division down the 9 Mile Road towards the fighting. Just as Johnston leaves, Confederate President Jefferson Davis arrives on horseback to monitor the progress of the battle. More than one officer believes that Johnston has seen Davis approaching and had left hurriedly to avoid talking to him. By 3:30 p.m., sheer pandemonium has enveloped Casey's faltering line. With Rhodes and Rains pressing in from two directions, Casey's troops crumble. D.H. Hill's victorious Confederates are swarming in from three directions. Carter's Virginia battery is brought forward to rake the redoubt with canister and shot, and what is left of Casey's 3rd Division is running to the rear for their very lives. Despite Casey's desperate attempt to rally them, one officer remembered seeing the general raging among his retreating men, hatless, his white hair streaming in the wind. Another veteran of the battle wrote, "Old Casey was as brave as a lion, and remained while his men would stand. He lost everything but the clothes he stood in." 8 of Casey's guns are abandoned to the rebels. The attackers cut through the abandoned Union camps and charge over a clearing in front of the 2nd Union line of works 150 yards behind Casey's redoubt. The line of abattis at Seven Pines is more strongly held than Keyes' original line. At this point, Keyes and 2 regiments from Couch's 1st Division finally arrive on the field. Casey's scattered troops join Couch's 1st Division, which is already moving into place on the new line of defense. Shocked by the carnage and mayhem, the 4th Corps commander quickly orders all his forces to fall back to Seven Pines and awaits the arrival of Heintzelman's 2 divisions in 3rd Corps. On the Confederate right, Rains' regiment slowed down on the edge of White Oak Swamp, leaving Rhodes' men to take most of the heavy defensive fire. Wounded in the arm, Rhodes stays in the saddle and continues to lead his troops. They are under heavy fire in the clearing in front of the abattis when more Union troops from Kearny's 3rd Division of 3rd Corps appear in the woods to the right. Rhodes has to shift some of his men to the right to meet the new threat. Ahead of Rhodes' brigade, Colonel John B. Gordon in the 6th Alabama pushed deep into the Union lines. Gordon's lieutenant colonel, adjutant, and major are killed. Half the company officers and many of the rank and file also fall dead or wounded. Gordon is conspicuous on his horse, and some of his men hear the enemy shouting, "Shoot that man on horseback!" Bullets tear through the colonel's uniform and strike his canteen, but never touch him. Among the wounded, Colonel Gordon glimpses his 19-year-old brother, Captain Augustus Gordon, lying amid a scattering of dead men. The younger Gordon was shot through the lungs. Asserting that his brother is still alive, if bleeding heavily, Gordon presses on. Only after the battle does he learn that his brother will recover. His force is trapped under heavy fire on ground so saturated with rain that many men are up to their hips in water. First aid details rush about the field, propping wounded men against trees and stumps so they will not drown before they can be taken away for medical aid. It is not until later that evening that reinforcements finally arrive down the 9-mile road in the form of Whiting's and Longstreet's divisions. By now, D.H. Hill appeals for help, and Longstreet sends forward Colonel James Kemper's brigade to relieve Gordon's troops. Kemper's men meet streams of wounded comrades flowing back from the fighting. They push through Casey's abandoned camp, but come under heavy fire from the abattis to their front. Adding to the fearsome roar of the guns and screams of the wounded is the sounds of bullets ripping through the canvas of the tents. A Union soldier visiting the scene after the battle counted more than 200 bullet holes in a single Sibley tent in camp. Kemper's men pull back to take cover in the captured Union earthworks on the other side of the camp, pinned down under heavy fire. Eventually, orders come for the Alabamians to pull back. They give ground slowly, bringing back as many of the wounded as they can. When Gordon rejoins his brigade, he learns that Rhodes' wounds have forced the general to relinquish command to him. Gordon's regiment that day loses 91 men killed, 277 wounded, and 5 missing. The 373 casualties include 59% of the 6th Alabama, a grim record at this time in war for the heaviest loss by a single Confederate regiment. Across the Williamsburg Stage Road, the brigades of Garland and Anderson hit the Union center. After leaving the Williamsburg Stage Road and advancing to the northeast, Anderson detaches Colonel Micah Jenkins in 2 regiments. Jenkins pushes through the Union lines near the left end of the abattis, cutting off Couch and part of his force, which retreats towards Fair Oaks. Kearny has to shift around from the Union left to deal with Jenkins. Johnston reaches Fair Oaks by coming down the 9-mile road at 5 p.m. He plans to send Whiting's division to drive the enemy out of Seven Pines and secure a major victory. Suddenly, several Union cannons boom on their left. It is Couch's artillery, cut off from Seven Pines. Couch is leading his force back towards the Chickahominy when he sees Whiting's troops in the distance, forms a line of battle, and orders his guns to open fire. Whiting's troops are repulsed twice by Couch's guns. They surge forward again as the Union gunners run out of canister. The artillerymen keep firing with explosive shells. The fuses cut down so short that they burst almost instantly after leaving the muzzles. Major General Hill again orders his men to press their advantage. Just after 5 p.m., they succeed in driving what is left of Key's 4th Corps and part of Heintzelman's 3rd Corps and the elements of Sumner's arriving 2nd Corps out of Seven Pines. Although Johnston's headquarters is an air pocket that muffles the sounds of battle, McClellan back at Gaines Mill can clearly hear the increasing volume of fire. He alerts Brigadier General Edwin Sumner and his 2nd Corps to be ready to march. Sumner wastes no time. When a final order arrives at 2:30 p.m. to cross the river, Sumner already has his corps at the edge of the flooded stream. The Sears crossings, Bottom's Bridge, and the Richmond and York River Railroad Bridge are too far in the Union rear to allow the corps to cross in time. Sumner has his choice of 2 recently built makeshift spans. One brigade makes it across one of the bridges, but the planks are so deep underwater that the soldiers are practically wading across. The bridge collapses soon afterward. The loss of the first bridge leaves only Grapevine Bridge, which strains and twists against the flood currents. Colonel Barton Alexander of the Corps of Engineers looks on with concern as water washes over the floor planks of the wobbly bridge. The rough logs of the corduroy approaches to the bridge are mostly afloat, tenuously held together by tree stumps and grapevines wrapped around the bridge timbers. Sumner is not a man to fret over a nervous engineer's forebodings. Born in Boston in 1797, he has seen extensive service on the frontier and in the Mexican War. At the Battle of Cerro Gordo in 1847, a spent musket ball struck him on the head and bounced off. From then on, he was known in the Army as Bullhead Sumner. Coincidentally, one of Sumner's daughters was married to Colonel Armistead Lindsay Long, a fellow antebellum officer who was serving as an aide to Robert E. Lee. Sumner's soldiers slosh along their approaches, waist deep in water, to the crossing. As the first man steps onto the split log flooring, Grapevine Bridge sways to and fro. To the surprise of the skeptical Alexander and the relief of the soldiers using it, the bridge holds. Once across, soldiers of the 1st Minnesota watch 1st Lieutenant Edmund Kirby's Battery I, 1st U.S. Artillery, roll onto the bridge, the drivers lashing their horses. Oddly, the weight of the soldiers, horses, and equipment on the planks has the effect of pressing them tightly against the supports, stabilizing the flooring. By 5 p.m., Sumner's lead division, the 2nd Division under Brigadier General John Sedgwick, has joined Couch. The 8,000 men secure the position and set up a 2nd defensive line at a right angle to the 1st. Johnston is unaware of the new arrivals and thinks there is only a small force of Federals remaining in the way. Whiting's men vividly charge across an open meadow that is immediately swept by almost a dozen Union cannons. Kirby's guns hammer the attackers. The force of the blast pressing the gun carriages nearly to their hubs in the soft ground. More and more Confederates pour into the fighting at Fair Oaks. Couch's and Sedgwick's men inflict heavy losses on the Confederates, who are entangled in marshy ground. Brigadier General Robert Haddon is killed by a bullet to the head. Another brigade commander, J. Johnston Pettigrew, is shot twice, bayoneted and captured. A 3rd brigadier, Wade Hampton, is shot in the foot. Hampton refuses to get off his horse, choosing to stay in the saddle while Sergeant E.S. Gaylord finishes extracting the musket ball from his foot. A few minutes after finishing the operation, Gaylord is hit in the right arm by a bullet, a wound that will cost the surgeon his arm. It is now clear to Johnston that the troops he had intended to throw into the fighting at Seven Pines need to remain at Fair Oaks. Pushing the enemy out of the way would be impossible before sunset. Johnston orders his regiments to stay where they are during the night. About 7 p.m., a mini-ball strikes Johnston in the right shoulder while he is inspecting the lines. A few moments later, a shell explodes and drives a fragment into his chest. The bullet wound is not serious, but the shell fragment injures a lung and cracks a couple of Johnston's ribs. The stricken commander is being placed in an ambulance when Davis and Lee arrive on the scene. Davis asks Johnston if there is anything he can do for him. Somewhere between the spot where he was wounded and the ambulance, Johnston says he has lost his sword, a treasured family heirloom that his father had carried during the Revolution. Davis would not permit the ambulance driver to leave until the sword was found and returned to the general's side. During the night, the woods are alive with soldiers of both armies searching for dead or wounded comrades. Soldiers sleep wherever they can while rain drizzles down on them. Lieutenant William M. Wood of the 19th Virginia, like many Confederates, finds himself forced to camp in standing water. "I broke off small pines and piled them up," wrote Wood, "until I had a superb bed in the midst of muck and mud. Very few found a place on which to build a fire large enough to set a tin cup in which to make coffee." At Fair Oaks, Brigadier General William H. French is awakened at 2 a.m. on June 1st by Colonel Edward E. Cross of the 5th New Hampshire. Cross tells the general that in all the disorganization after the battle ended, 3 Confederate regiments have unwittingly bedded down in the woods only 100 yards from the right flank of French's division. French quietly shifts his regiments to face the enemy. He doesn't want to risk a night attack, but his men capture a few stray soldiers and a courier. By the time the sun rises the next morning, the rest of the Confederates are gone. Many Federals work all night on their fortifications. Captain George W. Hazard works through the dark hours, trying to bring more guns to the front for Brigadier General Israel Richardson's 1st Division of 2nd Corps. The guns of Sedgwick's 2nd Division, passing first, had cut up every spot by which artillery could move without first constructing corduroys, Hazard complains. West of Grapevine Bridge, Hazard finds 200 yards of water, 18 inches deep. Adding to his problems, the corduroy was floating on the surface of the water, and 2 ambulances had been abandoned in the roadway. Late in the night, an infantry lieutenant arrives with a 44-man work detail, but without either lamps or tools, they are no help. Hazard manages to get a new corduroy road built, and 3 batteries are dragged out of the swamp to Richardson's front by 4:30 a.m. Major General Gustavus W. Smith replaces the wounded Johnston as leader of the Department of Northern Virginia that morning. Suddenly confronted with the burden of command, Smith is nearly paralyzed with anxiety and indecision. Thinking or hoping that the enemy has been driven back from Seven Pines, Smith decides to press the attack another day. He wants Longstreet to remove his forces from the Confederate right and center and cross behind the battlefield to attack Fair Oaks. Such a complicated maneuver, Longstreet warns, is impossible to make efficiently through the swampy woods and brush at night, and it would leave the new Confederate right vulnerable. Instead of a full attack, Longstreet orders D.H. Hill to make a limited advance against the enemy lines at Fair Oaks. At 6:30 a.m. on June 1st, the brigades of Brigadier Generals William Mahone and Louis Armistead hit French's Federals along the railroad tracks at Fair Oaks. As the fighting spreads, more units are fed into the clash. Union Brigadier General Oliver O. Howard loses his right arm during the heavy fighting. In a more comical interlude, French falls headfirst into a deep mud puddle. Angry and sputtering, the general is fished out amid the exploding shells and shrieking bullets. Although confined to a relatively small section of the field, the fighting is heavy and intense. Greatly aiding the Union troops are the guns that had so laboriously been pulled through the swamps during the night. The Confederate attacks, launched without overall planning or coordination, are easily repulsed. By early afternoon, it is apparent to the Confederate commanders that the half-hearted offensive operations are a tragic waste of lives. At dawn on June 2nd, the Confederates pull back from the battlefield to their old lines outside Richmond. Struggling on the boggy ground and without adequate bridges to bring reinforcements across the Chickahominy, McClellan is unable to unite his army to inflict a decisive final blow against a retreating army. The Battle of Seven Pines, also known by Northerners who fought there as the Battle of Fair Oaks, since that was where they saw the most success, is over. At the time it is fought, the Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks is the largest and bloodiest engagement in the war's eastern theater. Union casualties for the 2-day battle total at 5,031 men, including 790 killed, 3,594 wounded, and 647 captured or missing. The Confederates have lost 980 men killed, 4,749 men wounded, and 405 captured or missing. totaling 6,134 losses for the Confederacy. After the battle, Major General McClellan inspects the blood-soaked field and writes to his wife, "I am tired of the sickening sight of the battlefield, with its mangled corpses and poor suffering wounded. Victory has no charms for me when purchased at such cost." Following the battle, Gustavus W. Smith is replaced as commander of the Confederate armies in and around Richmond by President Davis, who calls upon General Robert E. Lee to assume command of the exhausted force. Desiring to push the Federals out of his home state's capital, General Lee will begin reorganizing his forces over the next few weeks as a lull sets in over the Richmond battlegrounds, morphing his disorganized armies into the now officially named Army of Northern Virginia. McClellan's Army of the Potomac will lick their wounds from Seven Pines and continue to sit outside Richmond for the next 3 weeks as McClellan contemplates his next move. The first phase of the Peninsula campaign, the Union offensive against Richmond, is over. Now, with McClellan's complacency to keep his army situated in the defensive works outside Richmond, the strategic initiative will be given to General Lee, who will seize the opportunity to plan out a bold counteroffensive against McClellan's forces, intending to finally drive them out of Richmond. At the end of June, Lee will make his move in a series of sharp engagements that would become known as the 7 Days Battles.